Hello, I'm Dr. Philip Hughes, the Secretary of the Ethics Committee for the Christian Research Association. All of our behaviour in relationship to other people should be ethical. It should be respectful of others, with attention to the feelings of others, ensuring that we don't harm them. There are rules for driving to ensure that we drive ethically. Just having principles is not really quite sufficient. And so it is with research. Research is a peculiar activity, a very special activity. And we ask people questions that we wouldn't necessarily ask them in other contexts. Sometimes we ask people to do things which they wouldn't normally do. So in relation to research, there are some particular guidelines, and the federal government, along with the universities around Australia, has developed a framework for ethical research, which is summarised in the guidelines that they have produced. So all human-related research must be approved by an ethics research committee. And most committees report to the National Health and Medical Research Council of the federal government on an annual basis. All research projects which involve collecting information from other people should be reported, and that includes when you're observing people, for example in groups, when you're doing surveys, when you're doing interviews, focus groups, or collecting information from people in other ways. Now, there are some grey areas. If you're having a conversation with someone to explore the possibility of a research project and you're not actually going to publish the material that comes out of that conversation, then that doesn't need ethical approval. If you're using anonymous data from surveys or interviews collected by others, which was done ethically at the time, for example, if you're using the census data or using data from another published survey, then that doesn't need ethical approval. If you're using health records, on the other hand, that does need approval. Organisations can also do their own research internally. They can do their own evaluation of a class or get feedback from their staff. But then that research cannot be published. Psychologists have their own rules for doing their own testing. And journalistic research and polling companies abide by their own particular codes. One of the things we do when we look at a research project is look at the risk level. Negligible risk is when we're using non-identifiable data about people, or when an internal research for an organisation's own review. And in those cases, no ethics application is needed. Low-risk project is when you're doing research and all the participants are healthy Australian adults and they're not in a dependent relationship with you, when they're recruited by public advertising so that there is truly voluntary participation, when there's no identifiable information being gathered, and when there is research about non-sensitive issues, about people's work practices, for example, what they would do in their professional lives. That sort of research still needs to be, an application still needs to be filled. But these projects may be expedited, reviewed by one appointed person rather than the whole committee. All other projects require ethics application and will be considered by the Human Research Ethics Committee. The people on the Ethics Committee include the Chair, And the chair is joined by two lay people, a male and a female, who are not part of the college and who are not involved in research themselves. Also, there needs to be someone with counselling background and another person who is either a pastor or an Aboriginal elder. Then there needs to be a lawyer on the committee, plus a couple of people who have background in the research themselves and thus are used to doing such research and understand it. Please take this seriously. You may not think your project sensitive, but others may find it so. Sometimes, for example, information in the wrong hands can be used against people, for example in employment. I've had research projects which were politically sensitive, and thus questions were asked about whether I fulfilled the protocols, and it was important for the ethics committee to be able to say in those situations, yes, I did all that was necessary and I abided by the requirements. People do make all sorts of complaints. I've had complaints even about the colours that are used in a survey and whether that might influence the results that I received from the survey. If a project has been through the ethics committee, you and the college have protection. Also note that if you're setting a class project which needs research, please get approval for your protocols for the whole class. Remember that the teacher or the supervisor has the legal responsibility for what students do, even for doctoral students. Thus the approval is given to the supervisor and not to the student. So the supervisor has the responsibility of knowing and monitoring that their students are following ethical protocols. One of the particular challenges in research is finding voluntary participants, and participation must be voluntary. So don't ask people who might feel constrained to participate, such as your own students or members of your own congregation. Some other people cannot give their own consent. Children, for example, or some people in care. In some cases, special arrangements are needed for consent, such as people in Aboriginal communities. People within a church community or a school need the permission of the organisation for them to participate. So attention needs to be given to that consent process. You cannot ask people for names and addresses of possible contacts without their prior permission these days, according to the privacy laws of our states. And that means that the old techniques of snowballing, where one person asks for other people that they might contact, is no longer legal. You also need to provide information in order for them to give their full consent. An information sheet, an introduction to the survey, so that they know what they're consenting to. And there needs to be a means of collecting their consent. So if you're doing interviews, a consent form needs to be signed before you do the interview. If, on the other hand, people are doing an anonymous survey and doing it in their own time, then it is considered that it is not necessary to get additional consent. They indicate their consent by doing that survey. If you're doing anything with children, with young people under the age of 16, then you certainly need the consent of a parent or guardian, as well as the person's own consent. The next thing is to give attention to the content of your research. Could your questions cause embarrassment or lead to recalling difficult times? for the participant? Will they feel respected by what you're asking them to share? If the information got into the wrong hands, could it be misused? Do you need to collect information that would identify the person? Do you have processes in place to ensure confidentiality into the future? All research needs to be stored by the university. Again, the states vary on this, but the common figure is 7 years. And during that 7 years, if there was a court case, then courts can subpoena the information that you've gathered. Note that focus groups in particular are difficult. You can ask people in those groups to keep things confidential, but you can't necessarily depend on it. And therefore, focus groups are a little more risky. Also, when you're recording your information for your research, video recording is always identifiable. Audio recording is less risky than video recording. What will people get from the research? They're often willing to participate for the general good, but are there ways in which you can give something back to them for their participation, such as a report on the research? Now, it's not appropriate to give a bribe in order to get them to participate. That may well affect what they actually say, what they actually give you in terms of the research. And certainly it's appropriate to give them a cup of coffee or sometimes some small gift, but certainly not a large gift. But what will the participant get out of it? Are you furthering their interests in some way? Can you arrange for them to receive a report of the research? There are some basic ethical principles that are here. Part of it is respect for people, and that means respecting their welfare and their well-being. It involves respecting whatever other people believe, whether you agree with them or not. It means respecting their culture and their cultural heritage. It means respecting their right to privacy and confidentiality, their perceptions and attitudes. You're not doing evangelism. You're not counselling when you're doing research. You do that under different conditions, under different protocols. Research means that you're trying to understand and you respect what you find, even if you yourself may see things differently. Another basic ethical principle is beneficence. So you minimise the risks of harm or discomfort. You ensure that any research that is a little sensitive is done as sensitively as possible. You don't put people on the spot. You don't try and trick people or make them do things that they might feel are uncomfortable. And certainly if they are feeling uncomfortable with your line of questions or whatever, then they should be free to withdraw and can withdraw without giving any reason for doing so. Don't keep them longer than necessary. Don't ask questions that you're not going to use. Remember that at all times the dignity and well-being of participants takes precedence over any expected benefits to knowledge. Your primary concern is for the well-being of others, your research interests. You allow withdrawal of consent at any time, and no reasons need to be given. You give the people the option of withdrawing after an interview too. But you can put limits on that, because certainly in the research process, once the data is put in with all the other data that you've gathered, it may be very difficult to withdraw that data. overseas research is also, it's important to meet the ethical requirements and legal requirements of the country where the research is taking place. And that may mean going through ethical processes there. You also have to abide by the ethics of Australia too in such cases. Okay, how do you prepare then for ethical review and the assistance of the committee? You fill in the appropriate documentation, a form that's produced by the committee, which asks you for the aims and the objectives of your research, asks you about your methodology, your procedures for finding participants, how many participants and what kind of sample you're expecting to obtain. There's some specific ethical questions to answer about those special conditions. You'll also need to provide that information sheet that you will give to the participants of your research. And you need to provide the consent form so that that can be checked by the committee. And finally, you will also need to indicate to them the sorts of questions that you may be asking in an interview. We don't need to know the exact questions, but certainly the sorts of things that you'll be saying. Or you submit your survey. The role of the Ethics Committee is to assist you to do your research ethically. It's not there to put barriers in the way just for the sake of it, but rather to assist you in order to find ways to ensure that your research is done respecting the well-being and of others. So usually the Ethics Committee meets with the researcher and the supervisor so that the research can be discussed. And the Research Committee can understand what the researcher wants to achieve. Together, decisions can be reached. The committee also needs to hear from you if you decide after the committee to do your research a little differently, and it also requires brief annual reports on your research. We wish you well as you conduct your research and as you explore human culture and human beings and their interests and well-being so that we can all live better in this world.